Our first speaker that will be a part of tonight's program is Melilssa Runck. She is a local extension educator in Pipestone and Murray counties. Her and her husband live in southwestern Minnesota with their daughter, and they raise Hereford, semi-influenced cattle, as well as row crops. Melilssa grew up on a Hereford and Angus operation in southeast South Dakota and received her BS in animal science from South Dakota State University and her master's in applied science in beef production, specializing through University of Nebraska-Lincoln with minors in ruminant nutrition. Our second presenter for tonight's program is Joe Armstrong. Joe attended the University of Minnesota for his veterinary degree and practiced in southeastern Minnesota at Anderson Veterinary Services in Zumbrota. While in practice, Joe worked with a number of different dairy and beef producers of all sizes and spent time at several auction markets. Joe joined the University of Minnesota Extension team back in 2019 as the Cattle Production System Extension Educator. So welcome to Melilssa and Joe, and feel free to take it away.
All right, thank you. Just want to give a shout out to our previous presentations in this series. The first one in the series was with Troy Salzer, who is the St. Louis County Extension Educator, and he did one on grazing and reducing costs and saving time and in the winter and before winter and everything grazing. It was excellent. It's available on our YouTube channel at the link there. So if you want to watch it, it's available right now. The second in the series was done by Dr. Eric Mosel, who's an extension educator up in Grand Rapids. He looked at how to choose your calving season. That one's not available yet, but as soon as it is, we'll get it out to you, and it'll be available on the YouTube channel as well. So we'll let you know when that's ready. All right, let's get into tonight. We've got plenty to go over. Melilssa and I couldn't stop adding slides, so there's plenty to go over. We're talking, I think, a little about a different operation than potentially what Troy was talking about in the first webinar series. And what we're looking at is probably overwintering cows in one location for the entire winter, potentially in a dry lot situation on crop ground, a sacrificial pasture, and we're going to be talking in terms of a spring calving herd. Now, almost everything that we talk about tonight is going to apply to a fall calving herd as well. It's just that when we look at some of the graphs and the images and things like that, it's going to apply to a spring calving herd, so the dates will be incorrect for a fall calving herd. Just want to throw that out there so everyone's on the same page. All right, when we get into winter, we have certain goals that we're looking for, and really the big thing when I think about it from a veterinary perspective and looking towards the future is maintaining the correct body condition score. For cows, we want that to be a 5 to 5.5 out of 9, and heifers, we want that to be 6. Now, we used to talk about body condition scores going up and down and that being a thing. And really, the most recent research shows that isn't necessarily something that has to happen. And potentially, it's better if we don't do that and we don't ride that roller coaster up and down on body condition. So I like to keep everything stable, 5 to 5.5 for cows, 6 for heifers, and we want to do that all year round. But we want to do that through the winter without breaking the bank, because feed's expensive and so are buildings and other equipment. And we want to do it without burning out and stretching ourselves thin, creating too much work. And while we're thinking about winter, we want to be looking constantly ahead to set ourselves up for a successful calving season and breeding season. So there's a lot going on in winter, but those are the main goals. Don't break the bank, keep your cows the correct body condition score, and get ready and set yourself up for calving and the next breeding season. So tonight we promised we talk about scours, and I might have misled you just a little bit, because I think of scours a little bit differently. And I think of it as a systems issue where we look at the entire herd all year round. What can we do to prevent scours? So when I think about the hierarchy of importance for calf health, this is what I think of. Colostrum will always be number one. That doesn't matter if it's beef or dairy. Colostrum is number one. Then dam health and nutrition, then the calf nutrition itself, then the environment. how many pathogens are we exposed to? So that plays a huge factor. Calf stress, vaccines given to calves are way down the list. Genetics are even lower. And then treatment is even lower. We want to focus on the prevention side. So tonight, we can't cover all that. That's a lot to take in. So we're going to focus on the top four, okay? And really the top three. And when I look at the top three from a beef perspective, this is a little different from a beef perspective than a dairy perspective. Colostrum, always number one, but that is mostly influenced by dam health and nutrition. And then dam health and nutrition is number two. So we're going to talk about that. And calf nutrition is number three. But on the beef side, again, that is all influenced by dam health and nutrition. So really the top three things are all really, really reliant on dam health and nutrition. And that's what we're going to focus on. And I think it seems a little counterintuitive to think about that as the source of our scours, but we're going to walk through it and I'll tell you why. And most of it has to revolve around colostrum and the quality and how much you have, the quantity, and then the targeted nutrition decisions you can make if you do things correctly when you're overwintering your cattle. So here's two lots, different lots of cattle that spend all winter outdoors, and they have some key elements that make it successful. So the gold boxes highlight those key elements. On the left, we have at the top a windbreak, which is trees in this case, and on that side it works well with just trees because the trees are thick enough. Then a bedded pack is the next box down, bunk space, water, and then bunk space again. And on the right, similar thing, windbreak, bedded pack, water in the small box, bunk space on the big box on the right. And those are the factors that we really, really need to look at when we're talking about what are the keys to keeping your cattle outside, no roof in the winter. And so when we look at this, there's a lot of things that give us a starting point. How big do these things need to be? How many cattle can I house in a certain area based on these things? And they can determine your stocking density. A windbreak is number one. If you're going to have cattle outside, we know it. Everyone knows it. The wind is what kills you and gets you over the top and it gets too cold. You need to have the windbreak. It needs to cover the bedded pack at a minimum, preferably cover the whole area. Now, that's not always possible, and there's some other things that we can do to help with that. The bedded pack, super important for keeping cattle dry and comfortable. And if we can keep them dry and comfortable, we need to have enough space for all the cattle to do that. And the number that really works is 100 square feet per head. So that's the number we need to keep in mind when we're building a bedded pack. On the water side of things, 1 to 2 linear inches per head seems to work out the best when we're talking about mature cows. A little different when we talk about feedlots and other things, but that's the number that I like. And then on the bunk space side, we need to have 2 linear feet per head of bunk space. And the reason for that bunk space is because everyone needs to be able to eat at the same time. And that's the number that works. And we didn't just make that up. It came from somewhere. And this is where I really like to jump back and forth between the dairy world and the beef world. We found that number on the dairy side. That's what we provide fresh cows on the dairy side is 2 feet per head. And preferably, we'd even prefer to give them 30 inches. So we're not making that number up. It came from somewhere. And I think it works really, really well. And I'll show you some pictures that I think show that. So when we talk windbreaks, in the one we just looked at, so at the very top, this windbreak is a little sparse. The trees just aren't thick enough to get it done. So what this farm has done is they've put in a man-made windbreak in the trees. They've stacked bales, and that works really, really well. It helps a ton. It cuts down on the wind a lot. So that's something that you can do to kind of supplement your windbreak. And then again, on the bottom right, they've actually covered the bunk area with a man-made windbreak. Our model here in these pictures is Dana Adams. She's the local extension educator in Stearns, Benton, and Morrison County. And one of the things that we talk about with windbreaks is that we really prefer them to be fairly tall, but have some space in between. If we make it really, really tight together so that nothing can get through that, it actually creates a little downdraft over the top of that, and it doesn't really work as effectively. So we want to break up the wind, but not absolutely close it off altogether.
So that leads into what Joe just talked about. to build upon that, talking about, having the gap. So I really like this diagram. We actually use something very similar to this drawing here in the bottom when we're talking about temperature inversion on the crop side. But just to show how much of an impact, and I got to throw the plug in there for NRCS and Soil and Water, when they push these, these wind breaks. When you're planting these windbreaks and have the variety of trees and create that density to kind of get that up and over effect, like Joe said, so that it doesn't, all your snow doesn't come and dump right. Like, you can't see my pointer because Joe's in presentation mode, sorry. But yeah, exactly. Thank you, Joe. We don't want the snow to come up and dump right over there because where, of course, are the cows going to be standing? They're going to be standing as close to that windbreak, whether it's trees or a man-made one or bales or whatever, as they possibly can, because that's where, of course, just looking at this diagram, you can see that is where the wind speed is reduced the most. So just to put that in perspective, this is not uncommon for us. We got nothing to slow our wind down here in the Southwest, but just to kind of to tie these to some numbers, and we got the blowing snow right now, but 10 degrees. So we got a 30-mile-per-hour wind, and we got our fence, or we got our trees right there slowing the wind down. So the actual wind speed is 30 miles per hour. That 10-degree Fahrenheit temperature outside to the cow, that is going to feel like that wind chill is going to be negative 12 degrees. Darn cold. This right here, hover down there again, Joe, where the cows are going to be hunkered down. When we got that, that nasty wind, they're going to be down there by that windbreak. And with that windbreak decreasing that wind speed, it's going to break it down to 10 miles per hour. And that's to them is going to feel like negative 3 degrees. And so it doesn't seem like a big deal, but we're going to talk about that later on, just the difference between what it feels like and breaking up that wind and decreasing that wind speed, making it feel a little bit warmer, is going to decrease your energy needs by about 9%, which is a big deal when you're feeding a large number of cows. You can go to the next slide, Joe. So, and then Joe talked about, where those numbers come from when you're talking about space. We got to make sure that everybody's got space up at the bunk. This is just a very simple diagram on the left showing that, who's at the bunk. These red maroon circles, those are meant to, those are cows. And this is our, the big green box. That's, of course, our bunk. So the question is who is at the bunk, and on the right, who is not at the bunk? Of course, when we limit the space that everybody has to come up and get feed at the same time, the ones that are up at the bunk are going to be your BFBCs, your big fat boss cows. Those are your fat cows that are going to stay fat, or they're going to get fatter. Who is not at the bunk? Those are going to be our young cows. Sometimes, maybe our older cows, maybe they're missing, some broken mouth females, maybe the ones that are, they're lower on the pecking order, obviously. Those are our skinny cows. The younger cows, they're going to miss out, okay, because they basically got to wait for big fat boss cows to decide that, that I'm done. I've reached my fill. I'm going to go lay down, and then they can go on up and get what they need. That is not at all what we want to have happening. Okay, thank you. So if you need another visual, this is a really good picture from Dr. Tim Goldsmith that just ties all of that together. Who's up there at the bunk? Big fat boss cows. Who's hanging out over here on the right side waiting for them to get done? Our young females, our older cows, and again, the ones that are lower on the pecking order that are just essentially waiting their turn. So it really becomes important. We want uniform body condition scores. So again, to reiterate that, on our mature cows, we want to target on a scale of 1 to 9. We want to target that 5 to 5.5. Our younger females, we want them to be at a 6. Just knowing that our first calf heifers, of course, they got a lot of nutritional stress immediately following calving. They got we're producing quality and quantity of colostrum, and then we're also, they're still growing, and then we're expecting them to get bred back in a relatively short time frame. So their nutritional stress is really, really high. We want targeted nutrition decisions that apply to the whole group. we should be sorting them off and grouping them. Yeah, that it does create some more work, but if we want to manage them accordingly, unless, you know, in a perfect scenario, everybody's getting what they need to and they're at that perfect body condition score, probably not going to happen. We should be sorting. Our replacement heifers that are not pregnant yet, of course, we want those, you know, we want them growing. They have very different nutritional needs than our females that are gestating. Our first calf heifers and our second calf heifers, those are our incredibly vulnerable groups that are really sensitive to competition. Okay, so these are ones they're not going to be, they're still growing themselves. Obviously, they got size that there is a disadvantage for them. They're not your big boss cows. They're the ones that are going to get pushed away. But like I said, they're the ones that their nutritional stress following calving is going to be really high, just because they've got so many different energy needs pulling on them that they need to meet. And our mature cows, they're not growing anymore. They've already, you know, they've met their mature weight. And so basically they're growing that fetus. Their nutritional needs are a lot different than those other three groups. Also, to kind of tie in with the whole windbreak and, you know, trying to mitigate the effects of cold stress and wind and snow and all that on cattle, we need to make sure that we are feeding more when it's cold. Just a general rule of thumb, you know, we're talking about a cow's lower body critical temperature. It's, you know, it's easy to remember at that 32 degrees Fahrenheit. For every 1 degree difference below that 32 degrees, we want to feed 1% more energy. Okay, they need to, so what's happening is that at basically 32 degrees and above, that cow is able to, she can stay warm. The rumination process is keeping her warm. When it gets colder than 32 degrees out, that's when she needs an increased amount of energy to help her stay warm, because her body is trying to, you know, thermal regulate and keep her warm. And so energy that would have been going to that growing fetus or for maintenance or lactation or anything like that, she's drawing on that. So, okay, you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Joe. So what are some other ways to split groups? You really got to ask yourself, what is your current body condition score? So like Joe said, you know, we're really trying to target that group. You know, we're really kind of looking at, you know, a spring calving herd, you know, depending on what your definition of spring is, if that's February or, you know, March or April when you start calving. But the point is that right now, if you are a spring calving herd, you have an opportunity to make changes. Now is the time to be making changes. And I cannot stress this enough. If you do, you know, kind of an average, a herd average of, just do some samples and figure out, you know, my body condition score is probably maybe half a score, 1 score below where I'd like it to be. Now is the time to put that weight on her, because it gets way too expensive if we try to do that following calving for all the, you know, after all the reasons that I mentioned before, the colostrum, and then she's milking, peak milk production. We're trying to get her bred. It's just too much nutritional stress, and it's too expensive to run that energy through the cow, who's basically running it through the calf too. So we got to look at, you know, what's the nutrition that we need. So look at your current body condition score. And then do it, you know, can I make sure, am I just maintaining it, plus or minus, you know, where do I want to be going into calving? And just keep in mind that a change in one numerical score is going to be equal to approximately 80 to 100 pounds of actual weight that we got to put on her. Okay, so it's as a percentage of her total body weight. So again, you know, we could be splitting them. You know, those females that are just, you know, they're in a good body condition score, like, you know, we're just going to be maintaining them. Some of them we may need to increase that energy now because we need her to gain weight prior to calving. Very rarely, unless you had, you know, way more grass than most people had this summer, very rarely do we need to lose weight, but that can happen if you're concerned about some fleshy cows and, you know, maybe some problems going into calving. It could be, you know, something that you do need to maybe back them off a little bit so that you aren't having any problems during calving time. So I think, is that you, Joe? Okay.
All right. So where are we going next? We kind of set the stage for some of the things we think are keys to success in getting through the winter. Now, we're going to move on to, like, how do we not break the bank while we do that? That's really the key. And where we need to go is efficient hay use, and doing that well because hay is expensive and sometimes short, and when to feed what hay and why we do that a certain way, and then have a discussion with Melissa about whether or not we can feed less hay, and is that a good idea, and why. So hay's been the norm, right? That's what we always depend on. That's what we always say in the winter, that hay's what we use, and mostly because it's easy access. You can pretty much anyone can get it and handle it. It's simple to transport. All the systems are set up for it. When we're talking about inconsistent quality is less of an issue when compared to some of the other feedstuffs that are on the board. Now, I think quality is certainly an issue, but inconsistent quality is different game when we start talking about some of these byproducts that we feed. So it's expensive. That's the main reason we have to be efficient. It can be in short supply, and feeding this cow through the winter is our single most expensive thing that we do. And when it comes to the annual cost of having this cow in our herd. So it's really a huge concern. And we're going to show you a couple different things that we talk about in how to be efficient with hay. Limit feeding is what we're targeting. And that doesn't really matter what you're feeding, but limit feeding is a very good way to be efficient with your hay usage. So a lot of times, especially when we're talking to someone who's got a day job, we're thinking about feeding once a day if you're going to feed a limit feeding situation. And we're going to discuss how to do that where you're not actually putting feed out every day if you don't want to, but feeding once per day, keeping the labor and the work to a minimum. We'll talk about whether or not you need to turn your tractor on every day, all of that. And we're going to focus with hay on reducing waste, because cows waste a ton of hay. They mess with it. It turns into bedding instead. They don't eat a bunch of it. So limit feeding is feeding a certain amount and saying, oh, that's what you get. There's no free choice access to anything when we're talking about round bales or anything like that. So the keys to making that work come down to limiting competition. Because again, if you feed them a limited amount to the group, and then not everyone can eat at the same time, you're going to make everything even worse when we have that discussion about big fat boss cows and the skinnier older cows, and the younger cows are going to miss out. And it's going to be even worse because there's limited amounts of feed available. So we got to eat at the same time, and water's got to be available. Water drives dry matter intake, and it's a forgotten thing in a lot of this. So everyone's got to eat at the same time. You got to have water. And the big question I always get as soon as we talk about limit feeding is, oh, I can't do that. I don't have a TMR wagon. And that's not the case. We can do limit feeding in a lot of different ways, and you don't have to have a TMR wagon or a mixer to make this work. So when we talk about waste, cows not eating, standing at the round bale, pulling feed out and not eating it. It happens a lot. If you give cows access to a round bale feeder, 24-hour access, you get about 25% of that bale just wasted. It's on the ground. They didn't eat it. Now, if you give them 4 to 6 hour access, they're very efficient. Cows come in, they eat, and they get right to it, and they don't waste a whole lot. And then if you kick them out after 6 hours, there's very little waste, less than 5% usually. Now, I don't think a 4 to 6 hour time period is a great, it just doesn't fit in a normal work day if you've got a job off the farm. So I think the compromise is somewhere in that 8 to 12 hour access. They're still going to waste some, and that's fine, but they're going to waste a lot less than if you give them 24-hour access. So 8 to 12 hour access, you can kick them in to the feeder in the morning, and then when you get home at night, kick them out. That's great. I think that works well. You're going to have 10% waste rather than 25% waste. And that becomes a huge number when we talk about how many bales we have to buy in the winter. So if I'm going to look at having 60 cows, I'm going to feed them 30 pounds of hay per head per day. That works out to about 1,800 pounds of hay that I need per day. And to make that easy math and to put some slop into the system, we'll call that 2 bales. And I know that's pretty, it's not real close, but we're going to call it 2 bales. every day that you need to feed 60 cows at 30 pounds of hay per head per day. Now, if I look at this chart here and I say, okay, we all know that hay is getting expensive in certain parts of the state and in certain parts of the country. And we're looking at bale prices, or for a 1,000-pound bale, I just put some numbers in here at $50, $75, and $100. Now, if you give them 24-hour access and they waste 25%, they're going to waste about $4,500 for the winter in pure waste. They didn't eat it at all. So it's just going to be spread around that round bale feeder. And that's at $50 per bale pricing. But if we only give them 8 to 12-hour access and they only waste 10% of that, they're going to still waste some, but it's going to be much less. And the difference is $2,700. And if we put that in terms of bales, you have saved 54 bales out of the total that you needed for the year, compared by all you're doing is limiting their access to that round bale feeder. Now, like I said, it's really key that everyone can eat at the same time. And round bale feeders are notorious for not having enough space around them for everyone to eat at the same time. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. Farmers have gotten super creative in solving this problem, allowing everyone to eat around that round bale feeder at the same time. The best thing I've seen is that you create a gravel pad or a concrete pad, and you line your round bale feeders up in a row, and you make sure that everyone can eat at the same time, but you also don't have to be feeding every day. You just have to be turning them in and out of that yard where they have access to those bales. So when we're talking about bunk feeding, and I promised I'd show you pictures of what 2 feet per head looks like, this is what it looks like. When you have 2 feet per head, of 2 linear feet per head, this is what it looks like. And you can see it's still tight. It's still tight. Everyone is eating at the same time, though, and they can stand comfortably. And if you watch this group for a while, you will see one bump out occasionally and reposition and get back in line. But this is what it looks like when everyone can eat at the same time. And it's hard to tell from this picture, but this group is completely uniform in body condition. They have very, very, very little difference from cow to cow. So this is what we want to see with 2 linear feet per head. This is what it looks like. The other thing we can do is feed on frozen crop ground. I think this is a great way to go because you can make that bunk as long as you want, and you can distribute your manure at the same time. Now, actually, these 2 pictures belong to the same system. When we're looking at the bunk feeding, they feed silage and their force-fed mineral in the bunk. And then while the cows are eating, they go out and they spread or they put hay down in a line, and they do it in a different place so that those cows will walk the manure across that crop ground for them. So I think this is a great option. Here's a picture of what that looks like. And you can see the cows line up. And yeah, there's a little waste, but it's surprising how little waste there is when you do it this way. And that waste, I think, is well worth it to get enough bunk space and to haul the manure for yourself. So again, we're targeting uniform body condition, which gives us great nutrition. We can make targeted decisions, which results in better colostrum and better dam health, so that we have a calf that gets great colostrum and gets great nutrition from that dam. This also improves longevity, all sorts of things that affect your bottom line. So this is a great option.
I'm myself unmuted. So just going to put the disclaimer out there that to kind of, to build off of what Joe was talking about. And again, we're not saying that like a TMR doesn't work for everyone. And we're not telling you to go out and buy $60,000, $80,000 worth of equipment. But just, some things that we kind of agree on as far as if you got smaller numbers, if you're looking for some very economical ways to feed cows and still, get the benefit of kind of a TMR, but maybe it takes a little bit more work if you got to feed some of these ingredients separately. But from what you're saving in some time and fuel costs, maybe that's well worth it. So we talked about some best value equipment that we thought in our mind does a really efficient job, does a really a good job of getting the feed delivered to the cows, and it gives you that opportunity to be very specific and very precise on what you're feeding them so that you aren't wasting feedstuffs that they don't need. But so we just, these are just some examples here. This right here is down in the bottom left-hand corner. They call it a bale unroller or a bale shredder. It's different than a bale processor, especially like a pull behind one. But just something that you can bed with this. You can put your hay on it. My only recommendation though is that you do need to cut that net wrap off, because that is a pet peeve of mine. We got to get that off before we start feeding anything. But these things can be really aggressive, and the added benefit of using one of these is that when you're laying those, when Joe talked about feeding out like on frozen corn ground, you're laying that, assuming you don't have a ton of wind, you're laying that hay right out on the ground, so you're not losing all the extra leaves and everything, as opposed to if you were to grind it. And then you can deliver silage, you can feed silage, you can feed things like some corn byproducts with just a simple bucket. Also, there's some of these that for smaller dairies they use them, but they're just like a quick attach bucket, and then it's got an auger on the bottom, and you can auger out silage to the side. So just some things to keep in mind. A lot of these require like 80 to 100 horsepower minimum. Just as a safety concern, make sure that you are aware of, if you got a smaller skid steer or maybe a smaller, lawn tractor or whatever, just be aware of, once you put something like a bale shredder and a bale inside of it, are you going to be able to keep all four wheels on the ground, or do you not have, are you not heavy enough with your equipment? And then some of them do require hydraulic hookups. So next slide, please. And then, of course, we need to, we're going to get more into the weeds on this in a little bit here, but we can't just, when we're talking about your feed ingredients and how to do, how to lessen the cost of that ration and, save some time and money, we can't forget to think about what is our fuel cost going to be. And just, it's really important. We're just going to, I've got some more numbers that we'll talk about later on, but when we're talking about saving time, we're also thinking about how can we decrease the time that we have to start up that tractor or that skid steer. How can we decrease our run time? Because fuel is another one of those super high costs that we can't be negligent about, because that really does start to add up when you're talking about what does it cost to feed that cow per day. Depending on how long we're letting that tractor, that skid steer run, it can be significant.
All right, so we're going to talk about another way to reduce waste. We've talked about keeping the cows from wasting our hay, and ways to limit feed in different ways, and especially ways that we can do that potentially without a TMR or a pull behind bale chopper or anything like that. So the other way is storing hay. If we can really have a ton of hay spoil by leaving it outside and unprotected. So it's something we need to think about. I think this graphic really hits home for me when we talk about how much hay is in that outer 6 inches of the bale. And when we're looking at a 6-foot bale, there's 30% of that bale in the outer 6 inches. And to me, then that's what's going to spoil. If you leave it outside on the ground and it gets wet, it gets rained on, snow, everything, that's what's going to spoil that outer 6 inches. So that's the number I start to look at. Okay, 25 to 30% of your bale is gone. And then if you put it in a round bale feeder and you leave it out with access 24/7, those cows are going to waste another 25%. Now you've wasted pretty much, if you let it spoil outside as well, those cows, it's going to add up to about 50% of your bale gone, every bale, if that's how you feed it and that's how you store it. That's a lot, especially with hay prices. It's too expensive to be doing that, in my opinion. So looking at a building, simple building, monoslope, 20 by 40 shed, 6-foot round bales. We're looking top down at this building with the front to the bottom of the screen. In something like this, I think you could get 2 high, stack the bales 3 deep and put 2 high in the back 2 rows and 3 high in the front row because of the slant of the roof. And that equates to about 42 bales you can get under the roof. I think these buildings are pretty inexpensive to put up I've got numbers to put to this that I think are very conservative, and we can show you what it looks like in terms of what you're saving. So when we look at this, we have 42 bales in this building, and I'm putting a price on building this 20 by 40 uninsulated building at $8,000. I think you get it done for that. I think you could probably do it for less, to be honest, but that's the price I chose. And if we look at that with, again, looking at the same bale prices we were using earlier at $50, $75, and $100, 42 bales under the roof, we're going to say you're going to avoid 25% waste that you would have had otherwise. And you can see the savings that you're going to have on those bales per year. And at the bottom here, I've taken it and I said, okay, what's the break even on that? If we look at just this, if we look at just the waste avoided by having this building and putting our hay in it, what's the break even on that building if it costs $8,000 to put up? Well, you can see as the bale price goes up, the break even goes down. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but this is kind of an easy way, a partial budget to look at how do we make decisions on, is this worth it or not? If you can consistently get good hay at $50 a bale, you're going to break even at 15 years. And that's up to you to decide whether or not that number makes sense to you and if it's worth it for your operation. The thing to keep in mind is that this break even only is based on waste, and it doesn't include improved performance of your cattle, avoiding problems that are caused by moldy hay, all those kind of things that can go with having just better hay available to the cows. It also doesn't include other uses for this building. I think farmers are completely just geniuses when it comes to using everything to the maximum and getting the most out of something. And most of these buildings that I see hay stored in aren't just for that. They have other uses. And so when we're looking at the other uses, this is an example. It's not the exact building I was talking about, but it's very similar. This building has hay in it and stores hay for a lot of the year. And then right before calving season starts, all the hay comes out, or it's been fed out by then, and this becomes the loafing shed in the calving yard. So it has multiple uses, and there's lots of great ways to use these things in more than one way and potentially spread the cost of that over different parts of your operation. Now, the other piece of this is not everyone wants a building, not everyone has space, not everyone can afford a building. There's other options that are being explored because of that. Now, this is a study that was done at the University of Minnesota with John Deere and our colleague, Krishona Martinson, and they had 3 bale types. There was a twine bale, a net wrap bale, and a B wrap bale. Now, a B wrap is a specialty wrap that sheds more moisture, but still allows the bale to breathe. So all 3 of these bale types were stored outside for 16 months post-harvest, just on pallets. So they weren't on the ground, but they were getting rained on, everything, just outside for 16 months. And then at the end of that, all the bales were fed to the cattle. And they were fed to cattle in 3 round bale feeders that were side by side. So the cattle had a choice of which bale to eat. And at the end of each day, all the waste was collected and weighed, and the bales were weighed so that they knew how much the cattle ate. And what it came down to is that cattle are great at identifying quality, and they know which one they prefer right away. They actually ate twice as much of the B wrap bale as the other 2 bales. So they know which one they prefer because that one was the least spoiled, and I can show you that. As we look at this chart here, we're seeing the 3 different styles of bales, the twine, the net wrap, and the B wrap. And I want to draw your attention to the very bottom, where we look at RFV, which is relative feed value, and then the mold count. And the mold count is where I think we can really see the difference. We look at these 3 numbers. Initially, I was a little confused, and then I saw that we were actually 2 whole log scores different on the B wrap. So we're looking at 10 to the 4 versus 10 to the 6 there compared to the net wrap. Statistically, very different and significant in this study, where we see that mold counts were just so much higher because they're stored outside in the wet, in the moisture, and the B wrap is actually better at shedding that moisture, and we have better quality hay as a result. So when we look at, well, what does this mean? Well, actually, there's safe levels that we can feed the cattle when it comes to mold counts. And what it meant was that the B wrap bale was safe to feed. It was below the number that we worry about. And the net wrap bale was feed with caution. We're in that range. And then the twine bale actually, based on the numbers that we have, shouldn't have been fed by itself at all. And I think this really demonstrates that cattle know, and it does make a difference. They could tell side by side, they had a choice of all these different bales, and they chose to eat twice as much of the BRAP bale. So I think I'm not saying that we should wrap all bales with BRAP. That would be very expensive and unnecessary. And it does require special equipment, but I think it's a great tool if you have bales that you know are going to have to be outside for extended periods. It's more expensive to wrap, $7 to $8 per bale versus $1 to $2 a bale for net wrap or twine, which seems absolutely crazy in the difference. But when I show you that they're going to eat twice as much of it, and it's going to be higher relative feed value, everything, I think it does pay for itself if you use it situationally. I wouldn't wrap every single bale with it. I don't think that's necessary. And you have to factor in the fact that you need special equipment, but another option that's out there. So now we're going to talk about a little bit of what hay to feed when. And I think that's very important when we have this discussion about what stage of gestation are we in, and when is our hay, what hay do we have available? Now, usually our earlier cuttings are our worst hay, and then our middle cuttings are a little better, and then our later cuttings are our best hay. Now, here's our same shed that we talked about earlier, the 20 by 40 monoslope. If we stack things left to right, I think that's the best option because we have access to all our different kinds of hay right away. If we were to stack back to front, so we put our first cuttings, which are usually our worst cuttings, in the back, and then we stack it to the front so that our best hay is in the front. That doesn't work because we're end up feeding our best hay at the wrong time. And so we're going to discuss why that is. Here's a graph when we're talking about pregnancy average daily gain. So this line represents basically the growth of the fetus. And you can see that it's not linear, it's exponential. And it tips up later as we get later into gestation. That growth happens quicker and quicker, and it happens pretty fast towards the end. Because of that, this line basically represents our energy and protein requirements for the cow, because they need to support that growth while maintaining their body condition. So I know it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think it's a good way to think about this. The energy and the protein requirements are represented by this line. And as we get later into pregnancy, the energy and protein requirements go up. Now I'm going to put another line on this graph, and dairy farmers will recognize it as a lactation curve right away. If we calve out in February, March, we don't have peak milk production right away. It slowly ramps up, and then it slowly tapers off. And then if we wean in October, November, we don't have, that cow is now dry, not lactating anymore, doesn't have that caloric need. So what you see is you have this period here where there's really not a need for a ton of energy and protein, because we're not supporting lactation and we're not supporting massive growth of the fetus. If you stack your hay so that your worst hay is in the back and your best hay is in the front, when you get to winter, right about this time when we come off pasture, you're going to feed your best hay first because it's what you have access to. That means that you've given that animal too much energy and protein for what it needs. And then when you get to later in gestation, when you need that energy and protein, it's not available because now you're stuck feeding your hay that was your worst quality hay. So what we need to do is really, really match our quality of hay to the gestation time. And to do that, we have to have access to all of our hay at the same time, ideally, or at least test it and stack it accordingly. Because when we get out later in gestation, the energy and the protein requirements are really high. We need higher quality feed to support that. Not feeding energy and protein results in a lot of different things. And this is where we get back into that scours conversation. Shorting cows on energy and protein results in poor quality colostrum and less of it, And then they have a poorer plane of nutrition because the cows are not providing enough. They were born lighter to begin with, which without a decrease in dystocias. So now you have lighter calves, but the same amount of dystocias. So that can put stress on a calf as well. So there's all these things that add up to, I've got more scours, and it's all related to when did I feed my hay and which hay did I feed when. I know that might seem like a stretch, but it's absolutely real. So what I'm saying is just, we need to feed our worst hay when it matches the dry early lactation cow that doesn't require as much energy and protein as our later lactation cow and our early lactation cow, where they're burning up a lot of energy and they need that energy and protein to make it work.
Okay. All right. So to keep going on what Joe had talked about. So when we're talking about, he mentioned that, we got to have our hay sources in the right order that we need to be feeding them. And he showed you, you got that graph to show what their different needs are throughout the different stages of gestation and production throughout the year. So whether you put up your feed or you're looking at your own nutrient analysis, or maybe you got to go out and purchase some, which I know a lot of people are in that boat this year, even if you normally do put up your own hay. How do you compare? I mean, you got a price per ton, and then you got hopefully some sort of a nutrient analysis to go with it, and you've got different types of hay. How do you know which one is going to meet your needs? It's important that you need to be making these feed comparisons on a cost per unit of energy or protein basis. So when we're balancing rations, the very first thing that we always start with, we balance a ration for her energy needs. And then we balance it for her protein needs. And then we follow up with vitamins and minerals and make sure those needs are being met. But, so based on what maybe you already have some feedstuffs, maybe you kind of have something in mind that you're going to be blending some hay with. So that's going to determine, what am I actually looking for out of my forage. And this information here, these numbers here, I'm just using them. I borrowed them from SDSU. Just because they're very, they're cost comparative to what some of our prices are down here in Southwest Minnesota. But really, I like the idea of adding in corn silage, because a lot of people, the rebuttal that I always hear is that, number one, it's too expensive. And it can be, depending on, price of actual dried corn, but as an energy source, it usually can fit well into a ration. But I just wanted to have these three comparisons for grass hay, alfalfa, and then corn silage, which, of course, we usually always just think of it as an energy source, but corn silage, when you think about what it consists of, is obviously a very good forage source as well. So when we're looking at, like I said, this is very, very simple, different, comparison here of these three forage sources. We first need to, so we've got our cost per ton, okay, pretty simple. But what we need to do, so we look at our percent dry matter. Obviously, we've got different dry matters when we're comparing different types of hay. They're not a lot different, but you throw corn silage in there, and obviously that's a big difference because it contains such a high content of water. So we can't just, it's not a level playing field. We've got to get everything on the same page to compare it against one another to determine what am I actually paying for. Because we don't want to we don't want to pay for water. We are, but we don't want to be comparing basically the water that's in that feed stuff. So the first thing that we need to do is we got to figure out what's our cost per ton of dry matter. So we're going to take our cost per ton of that feed stuff, and then we're going to divide it just simply by our percent dry matter divided by 100. Okay, so that would be like 150 divided by 0.9. That's going to get us to our cost per ton of dry matter. Okay, so we basically taken that water out. We're just comparing everything on a dry matter basis, which is how we always, of course, that's the format we want to get it into. And now I got to figure out, okay, so we're looking at this cost per ton of dry matter. And I've got, basically, you're looking at it, grass hay is clearly the winner. That is the least cost forage source. It appears right here. I'm going to click on that, Joe. At 166 versus, alfalfa is at 235, holy buckets, that's expensive. But I need to continue my calculations here. because now I want to figure out what am I actually paying for the crude protein, or our protein in that feed stuff. And then I also want to figure out my energy. In this example, you can use substitute, the crude protein, the red text for, either do your crude protein at one time, or the same equation applies to calculating your TDN, your total digestible nutrients, which is, that's basically like tells us our energy content of a feed. Okay, so basically, so next we're going to take that cost per ton of crude protein, and that's going to be equal to our cost per ton of dry matter, which we just figured, and then we're going to divide that by our percent crude protein. This is where everything changes. Okay, so initially our low cost grass hay, when we actually look at it, okay, so it's low in crude protein, it's a little bit lower in our total digestible nutrients compared to everything else. It actually, when we figure that out on a cost per ton of crude protein and then cost per ton of TDN, it actually becomes the least economical source, okay, for both our protein and our energy. Alfalfa hay is overwhelmingly, that is the least cost, the most economical source, that if we're looking to balance a ration for protein, we would consider adding some alfalfa hay. And then, we gotta make sure that we're meeting our energy needs, which is again what we would start with. We look at corn silage as a very economical additive to throw into that ration. So, what initially we can't just look at this cost per, on a per ton basis, because like I said, we got to do these calculations to make sure we get everything on the same playing field. So that would be, a really good economical least cost ration would be making sure that we're meeting our energy needs with that corn silage, and then to make sure we're getting enough protein, because, our corn products are typically low in protein until we start adding some byproducts. That protein is more readily available. So you can, if you're close to an ethanol plant and want to add some corn byproducts for both energy and protein, certainly consider that. So moral of the story, though, is that the least cost feedstuffs isn't always the most economical. Next slide, please. So when we're considering different feedstuffs, again, I just showed you that we've got to figure out that cost per unit of energy and crude protein. Okay. Again, like I said, we got to level the playing field, make sure that we're talking about the same thing. Got to, of course, take that water out so that we're not figuring, calculating, like I said, silage compared to really dry hay. And then something we got to keep in mind is what current equipment do we have available? When we're talking about, handling a different feed stuff, do we need to purchase something? Do we have something on hand? How are we going to store it? We've been hovering kind of right around that freezing, a little bit below freezing. But when we get to the dead of winter and we're looking at, temps for 3 weeks that are minus 10 degrees, are we going to be like chiseling out, wet distillers, or are we going to get like syrup to pour out of a tank? We got to keep all those things in mind. And then, as Joe talked about in depth, how are we going to get that from point A to point B? Point A is how we're storing it. Point B is the cow. How are we going to get it there and make sure that everybody has enough space to get their allotted amount? Something else to keep in mind is how often will you feed it and how much will you use? One of the big negatives that I hear from, we're in the heart of corn country down here. We got ethanol plants. You can throw a rock in, any direction and hit one. So I like I said, I'm a big fan of corn, of ethanol byproducts. I think that they really work well into rations. I hear from a lot of people that I don't have enough cows to, I can't get on the list. Like I can't get it delivered. I can't, get on the schedule to get some. If you called, in the past, call again. Chances are that maybe you're not going to go through as much as you'd think, and it really doesn't matter. You're not going to impact their schedule with some of the big feedlots as much as you think. Call again, see if you can get it through your co-op. Sometimes they contract with these plants, but the big thing is, like I said, now this time of year, we don't really have to worry about it. But once we start getting over freezing, next spring, how fast are you going to be able to go through it before it starts to spoil? Okay. And again, how much are you going to use? That ties into your distance to the plant. What is freight going to be? And I would be remiss if and I would get in trouble if I did not mention this, but when we're talking about freight and we're talking about, what is our actual delivered cost to the farm, we have got to make sure that we're calculating that on a dry matter basis as well. Because again, think about when they're delivering syrup to your doorstep, that's a lot of water versus like dry rolled corn. Okay, so we are comparing like apples to pineapples. We got to make sure that we're calculating that cost. They're going to give it to you likely on an as-fed basis. You've got to figure out what is it actually going to cost on a dry matter basis and what are they actually delivering to me. Okay, next slide, Joe. So back to the fuel expense. We really got to talk about this. When we're looking at these least cost rations, again, it's not just about the ingredients. I just, did some average, some dyed farm fuel, 4.77 a gallon. Dr. Alfredo, he always, he uses the equation that you're going to go through about 4 gallons of diesel an hour if you got a tractor running. So the question is, do you got a tractor running for an hour each day, 2 hours each day? Do you go every other day, or can you make it every couple of days before you got to fire that up? And then it comes down to how many head am I spreading that cost out across? And I did the math for you, but just, if you got, just as an example, 20, 40, 60 cows, this is your overhead cost just in fuel alone. When you have to start that tractor up and let it run for an hour to feed cows, to bed, do whatever, this is your cost that you need to add to that ration cost on a per head per day basis. So even just firing up that tractor to, like I said, to feed for an hour, every day you're looking at an actual, an additional cost of like 32 cents up to like $1 per head per day. Obviously, we, the longer we're letting that tractor run, and the higher that gets, we can spread that out the more cows we get, but we got to be really efficient in how we're doing that. So, okay, Joe. So what is the most cost-effective feed? It really depends on what your objective is. And I hate the phrase, typical extension phrase, it depends. But it really does. Like that's Joe and I, that was our take home here all along, was that we're going to try to give you as many options and as many suggestions and as many things to consider, because literally every single operation is so incredibly different. But it really comes down to a few main things. What are we feeding or supplementing, and why? Are we trying to maintain body condition? Are we trying to increase her energy so that we can increase a body condition score prior to calving? Again, it is much more economical to try to put weight on her and that growing fetus, as opposed to trying to put that extra condition on after she's calved. Okay, because then she's milking, and it takes a lot more energy. It's a lot cheaper to do it now. What do you have on hand, or you can get where you're at? Again, I'm the first person to admit about including like beet pulp in a ration. I don't know, we don't have a lot of sugar beets down here in Southwest Minnesota. But if you're close to an ethanol plant, if you got any sort of byproducts that you can be including in your ration, again, like don't get sticker shock when you're looking at cheap, poor quality CRP hay versus like any sort of ethanol byproduct. You've got to compare them on a cost per unit of crude protein and total digestible nutrients to see what you actually have. How can you supplement what you already have? Troy talked about this 2 weeks ago when he talked about extending the grazing season. If you have access to either some cover crops or something that you can graze, especially down by us, obviously we've got a lot of corn ground. We've got corn stalks. Can you put a protein barrel out there, and what's just the cost savings alone on not feeding them your dry forage, your good alfalfa, or your some grass hay, keeping them out there, giving them that exercise, and just putting a protein tub in front of them so that they can better digest those stalks or that stover. That's going to save you a lot of money right there. And then something else that we just want to throw out there is maybe you want to look at considering feeding an energy dense diet. Dr. Alfredo, he's down at University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension now. He actually has some information on this, and there's other people that have put this out there, but I know there's so much variation in quality of hay, and especially the price of hay. Hay down by us in the southern part of the state is ridiculously expensive right now. just because we were all, I mean, we're in such a bad drought, and everybody, you know, a lot of our dairies are trying to snatch up some of that better quality feed stuff. So it's not leaving a lot for our beef producers. But there are some options, and there's research out there saying, I mean, this does work. Feeding an energy dense diet. So like Joe talked about, the hay has been the norm. I mean, that's kind of the given. We feed as much forage, as much hay to cows as we can, because that's what we're trying to get by with. We want to feed them that low cost forage. But what about when it's not low cost? We can actually meet, we can balance that cow's ration to make sure that we're meeting her energy needs. And then we can get by with, we're feeding her enough energy that she requires. We're meeting her protein requirements, but we're doing it with less hay. Okay, so we've got to have some sort of a concentrate included in there. We still need to have forage included in that diet, and it's going to be at like 1/4 to 0.5% of her body weight on dry matter basis, which I'm just throwing numbers at you, but for a 1,300-pound cow, it comes out to like 3¼ to like 6 something. 6 pounds that she needs of forage. We've got to keep some sort of fiber option in that ration for proper rumen function, you know, and the buffering and all that. So we don't want acidosis issues. So we've got to have some forage in the rumen to make sure that everything's functioning properly. But we can drastically decrease what we're feeding in terms of hay by limit feeding her what she actually needs. Okay, next slide, Joe. And then just don't forget about your protein requirements. You know, like I said, we always start by balancing a ration with figuring out what her energy needs are and going from there. But then, you know, protein is right behind that. We can't forget about her protein requirements. These are just, these are the latest NRC requirements for a mature cow at different stages of production. I guess my favorite size of cow is a 1,300-pound cow, and I just did it for, you know, she's in moderate milk production. So I think it's about, 18 pounds or so. And I got the different stages of production, her daily crude protein requirements in pounds, and then on a % dry matter basis. So we can see here, okay, so we got our early lactation. So this is like the first 3 months following parturition. And Joe showed you that lactation curve. You saw that. We can see, go ahead and hit the next button, Joe. We can see where her crude protein requirements are really, really high. Okay, we can't stress that enough. You got to be making sure you are meeting, these are the absolute minimum values that you have to be giving her. Okay, I know some people are probably looking at that going, that seems really low. Okay, again, these are the minimum values we want to make sure that we're balancing their action for. All right, on the flip side of that though, look at where she's at, what her crude protein requirements are mid-gestation. Okay. The important thing here is that, yes, we've got to make sure that we're not shorting her on her protein requirements. We've got to make sure, though, that we're doing our part to back her down at the different stages of gestation for different production cycles, because we don't want to be overfeeding her protein. What happens, it's very inefficient to be feeding her extra protein. It costs us a lot of money, but then it actually takes her energy to get rid of that excess protein that she can't use. Like Joe said earlier, it's basically, it's ended up it's going out the back end of the cow, literally. So we've got to make sure that we are either balancing that ration ourselves, or we're working with our nutritionist. We've got to be changing that. You see the different stages here. We should be balancing our ration. If we're dry lotting, we got to make sure that we're hitting her needs at least 4 times a year. Okay, if we don't have grass that she's running out on. Okay, next one. Oh, that's you, Joe.
All right, as promised, a brief scours discussion. We talked about how there's the top 3 things are all related to dam health and nutrition. The last thing is pathogen exposure. And we need to consider where the animals are actually getting the scours pathogens. Big thing to think about is that they are not bacteria. The main scours pathogens are viruses and a parasite. So they're not actually bacteria. And because they're not bacteria in this situation, it makes them very hardy in the environment. They stick around. And all of these diseases, in general, this is how diseases transfers from older animals to the younger animals. So our cows are actually the source of our pathogens for our calves when they get scours. They accumulate in the environment. And what we need to be thinking about is, where are we housing cows and where are we going to calve? Because if they're the same place, it's not going to go well. You have a picture here on the right that shows you a lot where cattle spent a decent amount of time. There's a lot of pathogens sitting there waiting for calves to hit the ground. This is a recipe for disaster. So there's a couple different options on how to handle this, but having a dedicated calving area is a great way to go. It can be a little daunting when you look at the expense of building something like this right out of the gate and having it only be for calving. But really it works so well that you'll never go back after you do it. This lot needs to have the same requirements as any other place you would keep cows. The bunk space, water space, bedded pack, windbreak, that all applies. Depending on your calving area, you may not need a windbreak or a bedded pack. I still think a bedded pack is a great idea if you're in a dry lot, no matter the time of year. But the idea is to keep cows out of this area as much as possible. It can certainly serve as your emergency shelter area when you have inclement weather coming in the winter or whatever you need to do there. But as soon as that's over, get the cows out, because we cannot be accumulating pathogens in that area. And usually everything stays frozen and you can't clean it when you need to before you put cows in there to calve. So having a dedicated calving area is certainly worth your time. And having a lot, you just have to be avoid the temptation of loading it up with animals and getting it dirty before calving season starts. The other way that this is done is with like the sacrificial pasture, putting cows basically in a site that you're going to, we call it sacrificial because the cows are going to tear it up and mess with it. So if you have a pasture that needs renovation anyway, that's a potential site for calving. But again, all these same housing rules apply: bunk space, water space, and then the bedded pack and windbreak if needed, depending on the time of year. One of the things that I've seen go wrong is that a calving area is actually downhill from an overwintering site. All those pathogens flow right down the hill into that calving site. You end up with scours again. There's a lot of different ways to handle this, but you need to be focusing on how do I get that calf into a clean environment where there hasn't been a buildup of pathogens and cows really haven't been running all winter. Another way to do that is a Sandhills calving system. We don't really have time to go over that, but definitely something to Google and look up or send me an email about it. I'll be happy to discuss it with you. It takes a little bit of space, a lot more planning, a little more labor. So that's an option as well. And with that, we are finally done.
I'm going to invite Brenda Miller, who is our Todd County Extension Educator, to come online and help us answer some of these questions that we have that have come up throughout tonight's program.
Thank you, Karen. We do have a few, a number of them have already been answered. So this is for Melissa. She had just kind of talked about this a little bit, but what would you consider the ideal cow size? This producer says, I weigh my cows each year at the same time, and the cows average 1,400 to 1,500 pounds.
I gotta say this tongue in cheek, because I like formulating things for a 1,300 pound cow. The schooling that I have gone through, they really prefer a 1,000 to 1,100 pound cow. For the feedstuffs that we have in Minnesota, Joe and I we go back and forth with this with a lot of producers. That's really, I don't think that's very efficient. I know that people are always pushing for the, an efficient female, but we put up so much feed, we put up such high quality feed. Without getting into the carcass side of things, it takes big cows to make big calves. I kind of like that 1,300 pound females, but like I said, I know that a lot of people stress that anything, about 1,100 pounds is more efficient, but it really depends on what your needs are in your operation. I hate to say that, but if you got plenty of feedstuffs and you're meeting her energy requirements, and she, you can meet her lactation requirements, energy. Yeah, you can certainly handle a bigger female.
Thank you, Melissa. Joel, you were talking about those hay studies. What was the quality of the hay at the beginning of the storage test? And have there been any studies about using hay nets?
So I'm not sure about the hay nets. The quality at the beginning of the storage test was identical, or as close to identical as it could be. It was not statistically significantly different between the different bales. They were all baled from the same location, same fields, all of that the same. So that was controlled as much as possible.
Okay, thank you. And then this kind of goes along with that as well. How would feeding on the hay on the ground, how would feeding hay on the ground work? Would it be too hard and destroy the ground? That's kind of like bale grazing, but you can go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, so feeding hay on the ground, the key is frozen ground. We like to use Minnesota concrete as much as possible, which means that we get frozen ground, and that is the key. Yes, if you're feeding on the ground and it's wet and muddy and we're not frozen yet, then yeah, you're going to tear everything up. Cows are going to tear it up for sure. But that can be lessened as well by moving it. Moving your feeding location also helps as well. So the fact that you're moving it every day helps, but frozen is really the key.
All right. Okay, I have 2 scours questions. Are utilizing SMZs on scours effective? And do you feel Scour Boss 4 and 9 are worth the investment? You're on mute, Joe.
Okay, so let's handle the Scour Boss question first. Yes, I think Scour Boss can be a very, and those type of products and Guardian as well, it can be a great investment. I'll say it this way, if you did everything 100% perfect in every way, I don't know if they'd be necessary. But the chances of someone doing everything perfect are very low. So I would say that, yes, they're worth it. And there's other reasons to be pulling cows up around that time anyway, when you would be giving those. So I think they're worth it. Now, the SMZs on scours, no, they're not effective. That's the simple answer. We're treating a virus and and cryptosporidium, which is not a bacteria. SMZs and any antibiotics are not the first choice for treating scours in any way, unless we're dealing with a secondary infection and you confirm that with a thermometer. And at that point, you should be using a systemic antibiotic rather than SMZs. So systemic, probably an injectable antibiotic. SMZs are not effective for scours.